Right, let's jump right in, shall we? Today, we are going to try to wrap our heads around Action Construction Equipment Limited.
ACE.
ACE, yeah, exactly. And you sent me a whole lot to look at. Their annual reports, financial statements, and even a transcript from their latest earnings call.
Wow, that's quite the deep dive.
It is. It is. So, listeners, if you can imagine, like, getting ready for this big, important meeting about investing in ACE, or maybe you're just,
Curious.
yeah, curious about how this company fits into this whole story of India's growth, well, you're in the right place.
You've definitely come to the right place.
So to kick things off, can you just give me, like, the elevator pitch for ACE? What exactly do they do?
Well, think of all those massive construction projects popping up all over India. Skyscrapers, highways, bridges, all of that.
Yeah.
ACE is the company behind many of those machines making those projects a reality.
Okay.
But they're not just about, one thing.
Right.
Their business model is spread across 4 key segments.
Okay.
Cranes, which you probably think of first.
Yeah, the big ones.
Exactly. But also construction equipment, material handling, and, get this, agricultural equipment.
Whoa. So they're really all over the place.
They are, yeah. We're talking backhoe loaders, garden tractors, even battery-operated forklifts. And they're constantly innovating, too.
Oh, really? What kind of stuff are they working on?
Their annual report mentions some interesting things in development, like a new 502L crane and a 75XW rough terrain crane.
Wow. Okay, so they're not just resting on their laurels.
Not at all.
Now, before we go too far, I got to ask, you mentioned EBITDA earlier, and I know that's, a finance term, but for folks like me who don't speak that language fluently, can you, translate?
Oh, of course. EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. And essentially, it's a way to look at a company's operating profitability.
Gotcha.
Think of it like a snapshot of how much cash they're making from their main business activities.
Okay. And speaking of that, the report, it mentioned some pretty impressive EBITDA growth for ACE, didn't it?
It did, yeah. They saw 83% growth year over year.
83%. That's huge. I mean, that's got to be a good sign, right?
It is, yeah. That kind of growth is pretty remarkable, especially in a competitive market like construction equipment. It suggests they're, doing something right in terms of managing their operations and generating profits.
So how would you size them up then in the Indian market? Are they a big fish, small fish, somewhere in between?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
They don't explicitly say what their market share is, but their reach is undeniable. They have a presence in 28 states and 8 union territories across India.
I mean, that's a pretty big footprint.
It is, yeah. That suggests they're a major player in the market.
But I got to imagine that kind of success, that kind of growth attracts competition, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The Indian construction equipment market is getting more and more crowded,
Really?
Yeah, there are domestic and foreign players all wanting a piece of the action. And what's interesting is how ACE stays ahead of the game.
How did they?
Well, they've built a strong brand reputation over the years. People trust them. And they're really focused on research and development. They're always looking to absorb new technologies.
So they're not just, standing still.
Definitely not.
And I noticed in the report they talked about their service network, how extensive it is. Is that part of their strategy too?
Absolutely, yeah. They have authorized service centers all over the country.
Wow.
It's not just about selling the machines, it's about supporting their customers throughout the whole process, building those relationships.
It makes sense.
They understand that if a machine breaks down on a construction site,
Oh, yeah.
that can be incredibly costly.
Yeah, time is money.
Exactly. So having a dependable service network is essential.
It's like that peace of mind thing, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so it sounds like they've got a pretty solid plan. But I got to say, the auditor's report, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, was it?
No, you're right. There were some concerns highlighted.
Yeah.
One of the big ones was the whole issue of raw material prices and how much they can fluctuate.
That's a big one these days, isn't it?
It is. It's a global issue, and it can really impact a company's bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, if your costs keep going up unexpectedly,
Exactly.
it's hard to plan.
And it seemed like the auditors were really stressing the importance of, strong risk management for ACE.
They were.
Right.
So are they doing enough, you think, to handle those fluctuating prices? I mean, it's not like they can just, wish them away.
Right. Well, mitigating the impact of those changing commodity prices, that's essential for any company that relies heavily on raw materials.
That'd be part of the plan.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not just about weathering the storm. It's about having strategies in place,
Yeah.
to anticipate those changes and adapt quickly.
So we've got this, interesting picture emerging here, right? Strong performance, ambitious growth plans, but also some real risks to consider.
Absolutely.
So let's shift gears a little bit. What about their corporate governance? How do they run the show over there?
Well, from what I've seen in their annual report, they seem to have a pretty solid corporate governance structure in place. They've got a well-defined board of directors
Oh,
with a good number of independent directors, which is usually a good sign.
yeah.
And they've also set up various committees to ensure things are running smoothly.
Like what kind of committees?
Well, like a compliance committee to make sure they're following all the rules, a risk management committee, of course, and a committee focused on stakeholder relations.
So they're really trying to cover all the bases.
It seems that way, yeah. And it's not just talk either. They clearly state their commitment to following all those regulations set by the Securities and Exchange Board of India. SEBI, right. So they're walking the walk when it comes to transparency and regulatory compliance.
It sounds like they're taking it seriously.
They are, yeah. It's not just about ticking boxes. It's about building trust with investors and operating ethically.
Now, speaking of leadership, there was a mention in the report about some potential changes at the top, wasn't there?
Yes. They mentioned the plan to reappoint Mrs. Surbi Garg as executive director
Okay.
for another 5 years, starting April 1, 2025.
So a little bit of continuity there.
You'd think so, right? But there's a little catch.
What's that?
The board and the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, they have the option to adjust the terms of her reappointment and even her compensation.
Oh, interesting. So it's not like a done deal.
Not completely, no. It'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
It will. Okay, so let's switch gears again. What about sustainability? Is that a big focus for them?
It definitely seems to be, yeah. They highlighted all sorts of efforts in their annual report.
Like what?
Well, energy conservation, responsible waste management, ethical sourcing of materials.
So they're really trying to bake sustainability into their operations.
Yeah, it seems that way.
One thing that really stood out to me was their investment in solar power plants.
Oh, yeah, that's becoming more common in the construction industry.
Is it?
It is. And it makes sense, both for the environment and for their bottom line.
Yeah?
Reducing energy costs and being more energy efficient.
Yeah, that's win-win.
Exactly.
And they're not just focused on the energy side of things, are they? They also mentioned something about responsible waste disposal, especially when it comes to hazardous materials.
Right. They talked about working with authorized recyclers and disposal operators to make sure everything is handled properly, which is important in an industry like construction where there can be a lot of, waste generated.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
Business model, growth potential, competition, risk factors, sustainability. What's the big takeaway then when it comes to ACE's growth prospects? What's the big picture?
Well, we already talked about that booming Indian crane market.
Right.
And ACE is really well positioned to benefit from that growth.
Okay.
But their ambitions go even further. They're looking at both organic growth, growing their existing business, and inorganic growth, which could mean acquisitions or new product lines.
Yeah, they mentioned that in the report, didn't they?
They did, yeah. And with their strong financial performance,
Yeah.
they're probably in a good position to make some strategic moves if the right opportunities come along.
Makes sense. But I got to say, to really get a handle on their current trajectory and their plans for the future, I think we need to look at that Q1 FY25 earnings call transcript you sent.
Oh, absolutely.
That's where we'll get the most up-to-date picture.
Definitely.
All right, well, let's take a quick break, and then we'll dive into that transcript and see what gems we can uncover.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so let's dig into this earnings call transcript. What were some of the key things that jumped out at you?
Well, remember that EBITDA growth we talked about, that impressive 83% jump?
Oh, yeah. Hard to forget that.
Well, it sounds like that momentum has continued into the first quarter of FY25. They don't give us specific numbers yet, but the overall tone is very positive, very optimistic.
So they're not just, talking a big game. They're actually, delivering.
Yeah.
What about those risk factors, though, that we talked about, like the raw material prices, that volatility? Any updates on how they're managing that?
It's interesting. There wasn't a lot of direct discussion about commodity prices during the call, but they did emphasize their efforts to, optimize costs, make things more efficient.
Maybe they're trying to, get ahead of it, even if they're not, spelling it out for us.
It's possible, yeah. We might get more details later in the year, as things develop. It's still early.
Right, right. Now, what about those potential acquisitions we were talking about? Did they shed any light on those plans?
No, no concrete announcements. But they did hint at exploring some, strategic opportunities, things that would help them expand their product line, reach new markets, that kind of thing.
So they're keeping their options open.
Definitely. And with their strong financial performance, they're in a good position to, make a move when the time is right.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it all goes back to that idea of ACE being so closely tied to India's growth story. As
Yeah.
India invests in infrastructure, companies like ACE, they benefit.
Exactly. They're riding that wave.
But even with a good track record,
Mhm.
solid financials, a clear growth path,
Mhm.
there are always those external factors that can mess things up, right?
Absolutely. The world is a complicated place.
Yeah.
Geopolitical events, supply chain issues, changes in government policies. Who knows what could happen?
They did mention some of those global economic headwinds in their annual report, like the Red Sea crisis.
Yeah.
That could have some ripple effects, right?
Oh, definitely. When major trade routes are disrupted, it impacts everything. Shipping costs go up, insurance premiums, it all adds up.
So even though ACE seems to be in a good spot, they're still operating in a bigger system that they can't fully control.
It's like trying to predict the weather. You can have all the data in the world, but sometimes Mother Nature just does her own thing.
Speaking of which, I was really interested in the section of the annual report where they talked about their workforce, their corporate culture.
Oh, yeah, I thought that was interesting too. It's often overlooked, but the human element, it's so important for a company's success.
They talked about, nurturing their employees' capabilities,
Yeah.
building a collaborative environment, even like celebrations for employees and their families.
Yeah, creating that sense of community.
Mm.
It can really boost morale and productivity.
And it's not just about keeping people happy. They also emphasized their commitment to skill development, training programs, investing in their workforce.
Yeah, that's smart. Especially in an industry like construction where technology is always changing. They need to make sure their team has the skills to keep up, to adapt.
But amidst all this positive talk about their people, their culture, there were some things in the report that weren't so flattering.
Oh, what do you mean?
The legal complaints filed against them from customers, shareholders, even some of their own employees,
Yeah, those did stand out.
especially the customer complaints, legal notices, consumer cases. It makes you wonder what's going on there.
It's hard to say without more information, but it definitely raises some questions. Are there issues with product quality, customer service, maybe even contractual disputes?
It's a little jarring, considering how much they emphasize strong corporate governance. Because you wonder if their actions always match their words.
You're right. Are they doing enough to address these complaints to prevent them in the future? Are they really committed to that transparency they talk about?
Actions speak louder than words. We'll have to wait and see. Okay, so we've looked at the earnings call. We have a sense of their performance. We've touched on those global uncertainties. But there's one more thing I'm curious about.
Oh, what's that?
Their commitment to India. They seem very rooted in the Indian market, and I want to understand that a bit more.
That's an interesting point. You're right. They do seem deeply embedded in the Indian economic landscape. Their success is tied to the growth of India's infrastructure and construction sectors.
Exactly. And they talk about, providing jobs, contributing to the development of the country.
That local focus, it can be a real advantage, especially when they're competing against those big multinational corporations, companies that might not have the same understanding of the Indian market.
It's like they're not just building like structures, they're building a legacy in India.
That's a great way to put it. It's a narrative that resonates with people, both investors and the general public.
So we've explored their business model, their growth, their financials, their sustainability efforts, even the human side of ACE and their connection to India.
Yeah.
We've really gotten a complete picture.
We have, and it's a picture that's both impressive and complicated. They have a lot going for them, but also some real challenges to overcome.
It's like we said at the beginning, it's a bit of a paradox. But that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not a simple black and white situation.
It highlights the importance of going beyond the headlines, the marketing materials. You have to really dig in, understand their operations, their culture, the risks, and how they're managing them.
And that's what we've tried to do today, give our listeners the tools to to assess ACE for themselves. Not tell them what to think, but how to think about it.
Exactly. We've provided the context, the information, the food for thought. Now it's up to them to decide what it all means.
So to wrap things up, I'd like to leave our listeners with a final question to ponder. We've talked about ACE's potential to shape India's construction landscape. But what would it take for them to not only succeed financially, but to become a true leader in responsible business practices? A company that sets the standard for others to follow.
That's a great question. It really challenges us to think about the role of business in society and how companies like ACE can contribute to a more sustainable and equitable future for India and the world.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into ACE. Hopefully you've come away with a clearer understanding of this complex and interesting company. But remember, the learning doesn't stop here.
There's so much information out there in those annual reports, financial statements, industry analyses. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep thinking critically.
Until next time, happy learning. So big picture, like if someone's trying to really understand ACE, maybe they're prepping for that investor meeting or just interested in India's economic growth, what would you tell them?
Well, it's interesting. ACE is kind of a paradox,
A paradox.
On the one hand, they're a leader in this market that has like incredible growth potential.
Right.
Their financials look good.
Mm-hmm.
They're clearly into innovation.
Yeah.
They seem to be taking sustainability seriously.
But on the other hand, there are those issues we talked about, right?
Right.
The legal complaints, that raw material volatility, the competition heating up. I mean, those are things that could really trip them up.
Exactly. It's all about weighing that potential against the risk, Will those strengths outweigh those potential problems? Can they keep up this growth, or will they stumble?
That's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. It's not just a simple like buy or sell decision. It's much more nuanced than that.
It really shows how important it is to go beyond just, the headlines, the PR stuff. You got to dig into the details, really understand how they work, their culture, the risks, all of it.
And that's what we've tried to do today, right? Give our listeners the tools to make their own assessment of ACE.
Exactly.
Not tell them what to think, but how to think about it.
Right. We've given them the context, the insights, things to consider. Now it's up to them to draw their own conclusions.
So here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on. We've talked about how ACE could really shape India's construction industry, but what would it take for them to not just, be financially successful, but to really be a leader in responsible business practices, like a company that others look up to that sets the standard?
That's a fantastic question. It really makes you think about the role of business in society as a whole, and how a company like ACE can contribute to a better future for India and the world.
Well, on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into ACE. Hopefully you've learned something new, come away with a better understanding of this company. But don't stop here.
Right. Keep learning.
Yeah. There's so much information out there in those annual reports, financial statements, all that stuff. Keep exploring, keep asking questions.
Yeah, keep that critical thinking going.
Exactly. Until next time, happy learning.